Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie, and today we'll be talking about 4 ways to speed up your homebrewing process. Number 1 is using turbo yeast. And I know, a lot of you out there will say that turbo yeast yields to off flavors. That was the regular turbo yeast. We also have rum turbo for those making rum. And it is a yeast it's in its name, turbo, because instead of fermentation lasting X amount of time, meaning let's say 2 to 4 weeks, it speeds up the process because in the ingredients, it includes not only yeast, but yeast nutrients. So the yeast nutrients and the yeast are combined together and they accelerate the fermentation process. The yeast nutrients, by the way, are dead yeast cells. So these yeasts are savages. They eat their dead yeast cells. They eat anything they can find in the way, meaning the sugar. Any sugar they can find in their way to complete the fermentation process. And once the yeast eats the sugar, they produce alcohol and CO2. If you would not like to use turbo yeast, you have another option to speed up the process. So you can use regular yeast like distiller's yeast. You can even use baker's yeast. If you're a baker and you have some lying around in your cupboard, that's fine to use to make alcohol. You can also use wine or champagne yeast, which is EC 1118. And you would have to add yeast nutrients to invigorate the yeast. These are the yeast nutrients. And I'm running low. I'm gonna have to replenish this on Amazon. You can also purchase some. The links are in the description below if you're interested in buying yeast nutrients or the turbo yeast. Once you put the yeast inside your fermenting jar, you can add the yeast nutrients and this will help the yeast complete its fermentation duties. For the quantities, I would add the same amount of yeast as yeast nutrients. So if I'm adding 1 teaspoon of yeast, I'm adding 1 teaspoon of yeast nutrient as well in my 5-liter jar. Another way to speed up your homebrewing process is to add less sugar. So less sugar, why? Because the goal of the yeast is to eat the sugar that it finds in its way. However, if there's less sugar to eat, it finishes its job quicker. Therefore, your alcohol will be less strong. Instead of having 15 to 20%, you might have 5 to 10% alcohol if you add less sugar because there's just no more alcohol that the yeast can produce. But your alcohol will finish quicker. So if you're someone who prefers dry alcohol, this is a way to do it. And for the type of sugar, you can use white sugar. We have these little packets right here. You can use brown sugar, anything really with a sugary content. You can even use rice or barley. And it's not what you typically would do when you want to eat sugar. However, the grains have the sugar that the yeast can eat. There are multiple ingredients that you can use to add in your fermentation jar. If you don't want to use sugar, you can use honey to make mead, for example. You can use fruits. You can cut fruits, chop fruits. Just make sure that once you chop fruits that your pH is not greatly affected. For example, if you add lemon, your pH might be too low, and you want to make sure that your fermentation is at the optimal level so it ferments well. Speaking of fruits, I have a few avocados here. However, I personally would not use avocados in my fermenting jar because they would be rotten. Therefore, when you put fruits, just be careful that they are not rotten. And I know that alcohol preserves things. It's its own preservation agent. However, the alcohol that you're producing once you ferment is not 100% alcohol. It would lead to maximum 15 to 20%. Therefore, once adding fruits, you want to make sure that the fruit is still good, that there's no mold in it. And personally, I avoid adding fruits because it can affect the taste negatively if it's rotten. And if you're leaving it there to ferment for 2 to 4 weeks, if you have these chopped apples that you're adding into your finished product and it stays there for a long time, it might not necessarily give you the flavor that you're expecting. So if you want to add a back flavor to your alcohol, I would suggest using juice, fruit juice for example. But if you want that strong in-your-face flavor, oh, it tastes like apple or it tastes like maple, I would suggest liquid extracts and adding this at the end of the fermentation. It's based on your preferences. However, if you prefer sweeter alcohol, let's say you want to add that sugar, I would suggest if you want to speed up your homebrewing process to keep your fermenting jar in a warm environment. So you don't want to keep this in the dark corner of your garage or of your basement because the yeast, in order to invigorate itself, it needs warm temperature. At the back of yeast packages, it lets you know what's the optimal temperature for the yeast to ferment. Some of them are 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. Others are from 25 to 35 degrees Celsius. It depends on the yeast package, but the optimal temperature would be roughly 26 degrees Celsius. And this is room temperature or even higher. If it's too cold, the yeast becomes dormant, so it just sleeps and sinks to the bottom of the jar and it doesn't do much. It'll still ferment the sugar that is present, but it will take much longer to complete your fermentation. Therefore, what I would suggest is to leave it in a bright environment, in your living room, in your room, wherever the temperature is above 20 for sure. And you must consider that the 26 degrees Celsius for the optimal temperature is the temperature inside the jar, not in your environment. So that's something to take in consideration of. And I've heard that it wasn't good to put your jar directly in sunlight. Me personally, I haven't had a bad experience with this. So if you have any insight or any opinions on that matter, drop a comment below. And for more tips and tricks, we have a class that you can book in the description, and we tell you all these little nicks and knacks to increase your alcohol level, to make your alcohol complete itself faster. For flavoring, we give you proportions, and it's a really valuable class. So if you'd like to book it, you can look in the description below for one of our online or in-person classes. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.